Matt Maltman's essay opens with a thought experiment borrowed from Stephen Levitt of Freakonomics. In the United States, over the past 3 decades, shrimp consumption tripled. Why? Most people, even trained economists, reach for demand-side explanations, health consciousness, better marketing, changing tastes. But the actual answer was supply. Aquaculture breakthroughs drove global shrimp production up and prices down by half. This cognitive blind spot and our tendency to think like consumers rather than like producers, it goes a long way toward explaining our nation's policy failures and oversights, especially on housing. I'm Jonathan O'Brien, Editor-in-Chief at Inflection Points, and welcome to the Inflection Points Podcast. Today, I'm talking with someone who has spent years building the empirical case for what actually works in housing reform. Matt Maltman, across from me here, is a senior research economist at E61 Institute. His peer-reviewed research on Auckland and Lower Hutt has become some of the most cited evidence in Australian housing debates. His paper, Dispelling Myths, published by him and friend of the show Stuart Donovan in the Land Use Policy Journal, is an exhaustive takedown of exhausting housing contrarians. Now, Inflection Points has been lucky enough to publish a landmark piece of Maltman's ourselves, Best Practice for Supply-Side Reform. In the essay, Matt distills years of research into 3 principles for effective supply-side reform. The principles are as follows. Governments should, 1, focus on removing bans rather than reducing burdens. 2, think about markets rather than individual firms. And 3, control the inputs while monitoring the outputs. These principles are underpinned by the literature-defining example of Auckland, New Zealand, the most studied example of broad-based upzoning in global history. A set of reforms that improved affordability, lowered rents, and boosted construction productivity. Meanwhile, Australian housing remains some of the most expensive in the world, and our construction sector's productivity remains dire. As Matt puts it, we're losing the Bledisloe of housing policy, and it is not even close. But we can do better. And now, to guide us on our way, here is Matt Maltman. Matt Maltman, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Look, you grew up in Western Australia. You studied economics at UWA, and your honours thesis was shortlisted for the best thesis across all disciplines, the J.A. Wood Memorial Prize. What was that thesis about, and what drew you to economics?
So I was originally an English literature guy. Like at high school, I studied lit, and that was my favourite subject. Wanted to go and study literature at university. Needed like a backup option because not great job prospects out of English degrees. And so at the time, I was going to drop economics at high school in year 11. And then because of a scheduling conflict, I had to keep it. I got exactly 50% on my year 11 economics exam. Year 12, just got into it a bit more, different teacher, started to really grapple with the ideas. I was like, this is kind of really interesting, did quite well. And then I was like, okay, I'll make that my second major at university. And I was kind of like, oh, it's just a side thought, like a bit of an afterthought. And then I just remember being exhausted by English literature at university, where it was like all these big words that didn't really mean anything. You read an abstract for a paper, and it's just like, what is this even saying? What does this even mean? And then you would just like read these economic papers or these economic ideas, and they would just be so like coherent and so like articulate, and they'd be within some framework that is just really easy to understand. And so, I remember reading, like Freakonomics and kind of Richard Thaler's work and then all that type of stuff. And then eventually I took an applied micro unit, which was just these fascinating questions about, okay, like economic theory predicts that if you increase the minimum wage, you reduce employment, but there is empirical evidence to the contrary. So like what's going on there? And so kind of the intersection between when theory clashes with empirics, I just found like really quite fascinating. And so then I moved into honours, and for my honours thesis answered a question related to when you have migrants that move to a country, they often can't transfer their skills quite as easily. And so there's kind of a stylized fact that around 400 taxi drivers in Canada have PhDs. And it's kind of like we can debate about how big the migrant intake should be, but like conditional that we take in a certain amount of migrants, you probably want to get the most out of them. And so there's this concept called brain waste, which is like people who have high skills, they move to a certain country, and then they just can't use those skills in the new country. And so my thesis kind of looked at 2 angles to which we could solve that from a policy perspective. So the first is you can just get migrants to study onshore first. So a big problem is that particularly if you're coming from the developing world, Australian employers might not recognize your degree because it's just like, is it a good school? Is it a bad school? Have you got the same skills as a native who's gone to university? Very easy to identify if someone's from UNSW and they've an economics degree from there, kind of the quality of that degree and the quality of that institution. But if someone has a degree from some other school that you're just not aware of in India or in China or what have you, it's quite hard to really appreciate those skills. So one answer to the policy problem is let's just make everyone study in Australia first, and then we can take in them as former overseas students. So I looked at that. It was a policy reform in the early 2000s, which is exactly that line of thinking. The problem was that they essentially incentivized it so much that you had negative selection into those visa streams. So what you had was a situation where people were doing the bare minimum length of study. They were studying, once a qualification got added to the skills list, they would just swap into studying that, and then they'd kind of enter and just work in whatever occupation that they felt like. And so you had these really bad outcomes kind of from an employment in their field perspective, high-skilled employment perspective, wages perspective. But interestingly, they were more likely to be employed because they were just happy to kind of work in any occupation. So that was the first half. And then the back half was looking at mutual recognition agreements. So another solution to the problem is, if you're an accountant from the UK or if you're an accountant from China or what have you, you have a professional body that represents you within your country. So, Chartered Accountants UK or Chartered Accountants India. What happens when they sign a mutual recognition agreement with an Australian body? So when Chartered Accountants Australia signs an agreement with Chartered Accountants India and they say we'll both recognise each other's skills. And so I kind of looked at that as a reform, and that had a reasonably big impact on kind of employment in field and wages and things like that. And so that suggested that was potentially the more effective policy lens compared to the former, although you can imagine the way you could redesign policy to kind of better achieve outcomes in the former if you did a better job of it.
That is extremely in the weeds for an honours thesis.
It is and it isn't. I think an honours thesis is kind of interesting. We take in interns here sometimes who think about what they're going to do for honours, and it's like you can answer a very niche question very well. I think it's kind of hard 3 years of undergraduate study to be like, I'm going to answer a very broad question. But yeah, it involved me just reading a bunch of policy and just being like, where can I find a good policy change? Where can I find something kind of interesting, and kind of going from there? Yeah,
there you go. Yeah, maybe comprehensive is actually better in terms of it's more comprehensive than the average honours thesis. That's so funny that you started in English literature, which is also my background. But hilariously, I have kind of an inverse high school story where I dropped out of economics at the start of year 11 and moved into visual art.
Yeah, okay.
So who knows? Who knows where the bizarro overlap between us might have been?
Maybe we'll circle back around. I'll go back into English lit.
That's right. Was it the English lit background and whatnot that had you in debating, which is something you also did in university a lot? And has that prepared you to make you a better economist?
No, debating actually was a funny one where I didn't do debating at all for my first 3 years of my undergrad. And then you kind of get to the back end of your degree and you're like, what am I going to put on the CV to an employer? And I had a good mate of mine, Matt Hanlon, who was the president of the debating union. And funnily enough, we used to play rugby together when we were much younger. And then we kind of reconnected because he was doing economics as well. And he was like, I run the debating society, you should come down. And I came down and I kind of got into it very late. I was a bit of an unk kind of hanging out with all these first year people. And then I just loved it. It was great fun. I never made the finals, unfortunately, but it was cool. I got to travel a bit and kind of articulate ideas. And in terms of maybe a better economist, I think it's really useful for public speaking. I think that the thing about me when I public speak is that if I'm kind of on top of the topic, I feel very confident about it. But when you get up there and you're kind of not quite sure and whatever, then you get a bit nervous. The thing about debating is you get 15 minutes to prep, right? It's I'm talking about whether there should be a currency union in South America, right? And it's you have 15 minutes to think about it and you just have to go. And so you just get used to kind of thinking on the fly, using your frameworks and just throwing some stuff out there. But yeah, debating is interesting as well because university debating has kind of really turned into professional activity in some respects. People do it every weekend. They're always on top of it. I always saw it as kind of something I wanted to do well at, but it was a hobby. It was something to do on the side, but it's good fun.
And then going on from university, you were at the Productivity Commission, which is an institution that is sort of rigorous, evidence-based, but also sometimes it's quite slow to see actual recommendations implemented. What did you learn there kind of around the gap between producing evidence and seeing it become policy?
So the thing that I learned really well there is just your frameworks have to be very sharp. And that came across a lot when you're at the pub with your colleagues and you're just talking about, it doesn't matter what market it is, and people just have this ability to think through it. Michael Brennan, my current boss here at E61, he's really good at that, where it's just okay, here's a policy topic. you just see the wheels turning in someone's head and they're kind of thinking through your framework and kind of how you approach that particular topic. In terms of like conversion of evidence into policy, that's a really interesting one because there's kind of this big debate about if you have on one axis kind of how good the policy reform will be or how impactful it would be, and then if you have on another axis how likely it is to be, right? There's obviously some potential trade-off between the two, right? And some people naturally gravitate towards small reforms or reforms that will only make things slightly better, but you can market them and you can sell them to government and have them quite likely to be adopted. On the other hand, you can have policy reforms like tax reform would be a good example where it's pretty unlikely to happen. Maybe we're getting potentially more likely because there's a bit of conversation being drummed up about it, but they'd be really big reforms if they happened. The problem that I always had is that it requires an accurate understanding of how likely things are to happen. Like you have to be in touch with where you think the policy making scene is, where governments are, where political parties are. And kind of if you're in the economic world where you're kind of reading papers and you're kind of doing academic style research, chances are you have very little idea what people in political parties are kind of thinking. Like maybe you have some connection there, but people I think over-index on like, I think we should say this, but not this because government's more likely to adopt it. The thing I really loved about the PC is that you would read these really long reports. Then on page 450, there would be 3 pages on jet fuel regulation or whether health insurance providers or superannuation funds can offer life insurance or things like that, right? Like really wonky niche issues. But someone at Treasury one day will be thinking about this or kind of a line department and they'll just open up the PC report and there'll be 5 pages that no one else in the country would bother thinking about. And they go, okay, and there's no political cost to those reforms because no one cares, right? Like no one's voting in or out a political party based upon, these kind of very niche reforms, but they're kind of buried in the back half of the document, which is kind of this funny tension where what you have in the overview, what you have right up front, this is the big thing that the PC says. Maybe someday that gets adopted, like hopefully, but the stuff that's like in the background, I think is far more likely to eventually influence the political debate. Or not the political debate, but rather the policy landscape. So yeah, like I think that I learned a lot about those kind of wonky things potentially being quite an important way to influence policy impact. But yeah, like it's a constantly evolving organization. Obviously, I left in 2022 and, they've had a new chair now, like they're writing shorter reports, they're doing a variety of different things. So it's kind of, you're always trying to optimize somewhere on those two axes between what's likely to get adopted and what's kind of a big impact reform. So people have different preferences about those two things.
Right. And a large amount of the sort of utility of the Productivity Commission is to kind of have this in-house think tank that is doing this gathering of, stuff that is incredibly niche, jet fuel regulation, strange little stuff in our care sector that just will be on the table should government need it at some point, right?
Yeah. It's like you think about who your audience is. And so like, and we talk about this as well at E61, it's like, who's your audience? And it varies depending on what you're saying. So the audience for those types of things are some EL1 or EL2. Sorry, I'm probably getting too in the...
No. Weeds is good.
Weeds. Someone who's like a middling person at a government line agency or a government department, and they're just asked to look into something or they're thinking about a particular area, right? And they just pick it up and they go, okay, like, here's some evidence on it, like we can run with it, right? And so reform there looks like, a very, like there's nothing written about it in the paper, people don't notice it, it's just somewhere, in a piece of legislation, but it might make people's lives 0.1% better, right? And so that's kind of, I think, what you're hitting there. You're hitting that kind of wonky person within government rather than anything in the AFR or, any particular member of a political party or kind of those things like that. And I think those can be quite powerful.
Yeah, and now you're at E61, as mentioned. And obviously you're working for Michael Brennan, who was your former boss at one point at Procom. What's different about doing economic research kind of outside of government versus kind of inside of an independent body, but nonetheless kind of attached to the government of the day?
So we can work on whatever we want, which is both a blessing and a difficulty, where it's like, particularly in Australia, we have this excellent access to data. And so you can imagine that there are a million questions that you can answer. And so how do you really optimize it? And so at the Productivity Commission, you'd be working on an inquiry or you'd be working on a particular report, and you don't get to pick what those are most of the time. And so you're just working on something for a year and a half, right? Whereas here, it's like the creativity that you have to bring to the table to be able to go, we should look into this or we should think about this because I think that there is interesting work that we can do that someone's going to pick up and they're going to take and reform, that becomes much more bigger part of the skill set, right? And so that's a lot more fun. Like that's something that I enjoy a lot more. I enjoy the creativity associated with what's an interesting research question, how are we going to go about answering it? So that's like obviously, a really big factor. Another big factor about outside of government versus inside is your kind of platform and your personality as a researcher becoming more important. There are unbelievably talented people within government that you'll just never know their names because they can't post on Twitter. They can't, put a report out with their name attached to it. They can't really appear too often in public and say things. And so the ability to build a bit of a brand, both around yourself and the organization, becomes far more important and also becomes quite powerful because then you can start to have views and opinions on things that people will care about more generally and more broadly. So that's the kind of stuff that I think is the biggest difference between those two.
This is one of the things that I think about, and we'll transition over into sort of housing and your essay briefly, but I do want to stay on this a little bit. People like to have this impression that, there's just government bureaucrats who are kind of skillless and not doing anything. And I do wonder if the fact that it is almost impossible for people within government to speak on the record or talk about policy or communicate the fact that there is a lot of rigorous work going on behind the scenes. Like, I wonder if that is like damaging for Australians' perception of our state capacity, which is actually like quite high. I don't know if you've thought about this at all, kind of being between both worlds.
Yeah, I think it's true. Where it's like, you think about these big organizations within government, the Treasury, Productivity Commission, the RBA, they're big collective nouns, but like they're big collective like nameless organizations, right? And so when you know particular people within them and you're like, that person's really talented or that person's really talented. And even when you have conversations with people who work at these kinds of places and they put out a piece of work or they say something or they do something and then you chat to them behind the scenes and you realize there was a lot more thinking, which they just obviously can't say publicly. Yeah, it does give you a degree of more confidence within them. The problem that I think is going to be, I think it's becoming increasingly a problem, is that like we just are in such a globalized, high-skilled labor market now where if you're a really talented person, your options could be remaining within government and kind of being nameless and those types of things, or you could pivot into think tank world or academia, which you can optimize over, having your name out there, or you can pivot into investment banking or kind of quant trading, all those types of things where you make a lot more money. And so you kind of have people that are in government who are very passionate about government working well. To some extent, that's the market that you're dealing with on the labor supply side, whereas maybe 30 years ago, you maybe didn't have a lot of these other outside options. And so even people who maybe optimized over other things, they just didn't have those options. So.
Right, because there was less of this sort of competition in terms of like personal branding, right? Like having a LinkedIn following or thought leadership or like to, as probably the worst example of this. Sure. But like that is part of it. Yeah, I've sort of seen this. I have a former colleague who went over to the States and they'd done some pretty significant stuff within the Victorian government and they sort of left Victoria. And yet they found that it was very hard to kind of explain to a global job market what they'd done within government because there was nothing on the record from them.
Yeah.
And there's no real way to explain what the capacity of Australian states is as a parallel to places like the United States and what the level of thinking and so on is there. And that makes it very hard, I think, and makes there sort of be quite a long-term trade-off in terms of what we think about as, typically golden handcuffs is, we talk about job security, maybe pay levels or whatever, but there's this other limiting factor, which is the ability to move between job markets.
No, for sure. And, like you look at an organization like the Grattan Institute, which didn't exist, 25 years ago, right? And so you look at all the really talented people who have worked there over the past 15 years. Those people in a counterfactual world where that think tank didn't exist probably would have remained within government. And that's both good and bad. There are trade-offs associated with that. But, that ability to have your name out there and that ability for people to know, like, this piece of work was produced by you does give you more bargaining power in a labor market, right? And there are people within Treasury who build these really sophisticated macroeconomic models and they use them. And there are people within Treasury who write policy briefings and things like this. And, you can't, I think you make a good point that you can't really signal like as easily to kind of other people like I did this or I did that. And, people talk about this being a really big problem for women in particular within the public service because they go up for promotion and they have to try and tell, people like I've done this and I've done this. And it's like, well, nothing's got your name on it. So it's just your ability to sell those things and your ability to articulate to people like how much value you have. And, there's obviously research on particularly women and kind of other minority groups being less willing to kind of self-promote, right? And so that kind of constrains your ability to move up within those organizations when you have kind of men who are more likely to want to really push hard, like, I'm great, I've done these amazing things. And so that becomes a problem, I think, as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Moving, I think, over from a topic we could spend a lot of time on, which is, the dynamics of policymaking within government. I really want to talk about the kind of principles that you're bringing forward. And you do this through the lens of kind of land economics, through the lens of housing. When was it that you kind of became interested in this?
So it's interesting, right? So I was working at the Productivity Commission on a chapter on the construction sector on a housing report. And then I got put on a report to do with housing supply. And I remember I printed out dozens and dozens of papers, largely Australian research. And I remember reading through these papers and they're just kind of washing over me. And I'm just kind of like, I don't really know what any of this means. I don't really understand any of this. It's like, this is all just seems very nebulous. I felt like, to return to what we started with, like reading those English literature papers, right? Where you read these abstracts and it's just words and you're like, what does any of this mean? And then, I read a bit of Peter Chul's work at the RBA and, that was clarity inducing or whatever. But then I read this study by Ryan Greenaway-Grevy, University of Auckland. And it's just like they adopted zoning reform, housing supply went up. And then you're kind of like, that's kind of interesting. And then you kind of go look at the raw data. You just guys logged onto the Stats New Zealand website. You just plot the data and just like line goes up. People are talking about housing supply and you go into these meetings and people are like, well, you've got infrastructure, you've got developer financing, you've got all these other factors, right? We've just simplified it to kind of one thing. And it's just so much more clear in terms of the mechanism and in terms of what's going on in the economics of it. And I just became obsessed and I just read everything I could get my hands on. And that's kind of when I got a bit more into the work of Ed Glazer and kind of the agglomeration literature and all these other literatures, right? Because it just made so much more sense than everything else. And when you go to these meetings and people are like, how do we affect the housing market and how do we make it kind of more affordable for Australians or what have you? Well, hang on, like there is this chart I've seen where it's just like line goes up and you're like, okay, like why are we debating anything else? Like why are we talking about anything else when this is so clearly magnitudes of auditude, more clear in terms of the evidence base and a bigger effect size than all these other things that people wanted to talk about. And so that's kind of what really got me into it.
In interest of clarity, just walk us through really quickly what happened in Auckland in 2016. This is a story you've told 1,000 times, I know, but give it to us in the shortest form.
I've told this story so many times, people think of me as like the Auckland guy, even though like I'm not the Auckland guy, I'm the Lower Hutt guy.
You are the Lower Hutt guy.
So essentially in the early 2010s, Auckland City Council, or Auckland, the various councils around Auckland amalgamated into one council, which is Auckland City Council. And as part of that, they had to come up with a new land use plan. And at the time, there was a lot of research or interest in the research of Ed Glazer and kind of land supply economics and urban economics at the time, which was kind of creating this momentum and this desire to kind of allow for more capacity. And when you read a lot of the documents from around that period, it was a big thing about like economic growth and reducing transport emissions and stuff like that, that they just essentially wanted to enable more housing supply. So as a result of that, they adopted this thing called the Auckland Unitary Plan, which a draft of which came into place in 2013, where it was partially implemented and fully implemented in 2016. And that policy change essentially allowed for around on 3/4 of the suburban land in the city. You could build medium density housing around 3 stories high, around 3 units per block. And then around transport hubs, it was more intense, where you could build kind of higher density. And so that was kind of the gist of the reforms. And kind of what you see immediately after that is that housing supply takes off in the locations where it was enabled, the housing types that was enabled. It just goes well above its historical mean. It goes above its historical peak and kind of just remains there. And it's been well above average since then. And yeah, it's a pretty clear piece of evidence, I imagine.
I think so. I think one of the things that gets lumped on YIMBYs and supply side reformers is that it's all Auckland, and that's just one example, right? I think that's obviously untrue if you look at the literature, right? You know, you've got everything from New York to Sao Paulo. You know, that New York paper from 2025 earlier this year was spectacular. But it is true, nonetheless, that Auckland is like extremely prominent in the debate. Can you explain the context that makes Auckland kind of so damn studyable?
This is a really good question, and I really love this conversation. So I talk about this quite a lot with my colleagues around here, right? Where it's like there is a thing that you hear from really good academics, which is when you see a good academic paper, figure one should tell you the whole paper. Essentially, it's like, here is a reform or here is a variable that we're analyzing, and you can see very clearly the story that we're trying to tell you.
Line goes up.
Yeah, line goes up, or, the variable which you're trying to, the relationship between two variables is very clear. And often the best version of that should be in the raw data, where it's like, I'm not trying to pull your wool over your eyes at all. I'm not trying to do some sophisticated math or econometrics. Here is the raw data. These two variables are correlated. Policy is implemented and line goes up. And people can just look at that and be like, okay, that's the story. And then you're going to obviously confirm that that's the story. You're going to go through all the sophisticated econometrics. You're going to do your robustness checks. You're going to look for alternatives. But you can just see right there that that's what we're talking about. And that's what the message of what I'm trying to bring to you is. And so this is a really interesting conversation because obviously years before the Auckland research came out, you had the work of Peter Tulip at the RBA, which I think is very, very good research and is very influential as well. But you kind of have to be a bit of an economist to read those types of papers. I remember I went through it when I wrote the piece in Inflection Points. And, it's a lot of math. It's a lot of tables and regressions and things like that, particularly in the Model of Australian Housing Market paper that he wrote. And so, that's something that's convincing to economists. But, when you put a chart where it's like, hey, an area adopts a policy reform and line goes up, my mum can understand that, right? And so I think that people really like narrative. People really like the story of, in the real world, this happened, and we saw that we got this outcome. Because, again, to return to that piece from Peter Tulip, which I think is really powerful, it requires you to believe some degree of the economics and the modeling and the econometrics and all the how he's gone about that work behind it, right? But you can literally see it in Auckland in the raw data, right? And so you don't need to believe any of that. You just need to look at the chart, right? That narrative, that storytelling of moving away from we've built some big structural model, which you see in a lot of the academic work that I read. Here is some big structural model. We've made a bunch of assumptions, and there might be reasonable assumptions, and the model might have a lot of power of explaining the world. But I think there's something that lay people and policymakers in particular really like about a story, about this is something we've seen. It's not hypothetical. It doesn't require you to believe a bunch of assumptions. It's just this literally happened. And I think that's what makes it really powerful, right? Is there is all this other evidence that existed 15 years before, but it didn't have that. It didn't have this really actually happened in the world, and you can see that very clearly.
Right. It's the fact that it's a natural experiment, basically.
100%.
Right? The critiques of the Auckland work, they're obviously mostly embarrassing and dangerous and unserious. So much so that you and Stu Donovan published Dispelling Myths, an absolutely brutal paper that includes the line, which I just have to put here. First, even if D was the counterfactual, the available evidence indicates that this is ex ante reasonable. Second, D is not the counterfactual. D is not the counterfactual. It's just brilliant and incisive and just, completely indicates that people are reaching very, very far to try to discredit kind of these reforms. Why is there so much stock being put in hopeless attempts to discredit Auckland and its reforms and the evidence there?
So let me make a couple of general points first, which is that no economics paper that you read is perfect, right?
Yeah.
And so, we have seminars here at E61 all the time where people come in and they present their work and people will ask incisive, cutting questions. And the question that sometimes people ask is, a really tough one and it potentially pokes some holes in a paper, but people still walk out of the room going, I believe that paper on average, right? And so the general point that I would want to make is that when you read these papers, they're not perfect. If you wanted me to come up with some critiques of them, I could. But the degree to which that critique needs to kind of cut through and destroy a paper, not even close. There are things on around the edges that you can toy around with, but these papers are so strong in terms of their ability to prove robustness to their findings that it's what are we doing here? And to the point that I returned to earlier, the second point I'd make is that you can just see it in the raw data, right? And you just plot the simplest version of the data and you see that these lines go up. So, I encourage people to critique economic work. I encourage people to come up with questions. It's part of the reason why I publish working papers, right, is because I want people to tell me where I'm the weakest and where I'm the strongest or whatever. But those critiques are often powerful when they come from people within the field who are looking to make work better overall. So usually when we have questions and seminars and stuff like that, they're trying to get someone to think about a different angle, how they can make the work better, right? It's like, you can do this, or have you thought about this, or this is something that I might have a concern with if you could show me, this or that. With a lot of this stuff, it doesn't feel like it's coming from that place.
Right. It's not trying to improve the case.
Yeah, it's not trying to be like, well, if you showed me this, then I would believe you, right? And that makes it tough. I think that it's just had such a really big, powerful impact on the discussion here. Like, I refer to, Chris Minns mentioned, I think, words from the abstracts of those paper on the floor of New South Wales Parliament, right? And you see it, I think, even in Andrew Bragg's speech yesterday at CIS, where I think he mentioned a lot of the Auckland stuff as well, right? I think Claire O'Neill said it. It's just had this cut through. I think historically, when you look at a lot of the debates we've had about housing in Australia in the academic space, I recall this kind of before the Auckland stuff really took off, the natural experiment stuff took off. By the way, I should stop saying the Auckland stuff because it's also the New York stuff, the Brazil stuff, the Lower Hutt stuff, the Zurich stuff. Yeah. Before those natural experiments, right, I remember this quite distinctly, where it was largely Peter Tulip's work at the RBA, and then you had a bit of stuff from Grattan, I think John Daly and Brendan Coates. And then you had other stuff as well, right? When you look at what Peter Tulip published, there were a few critiques that were published of that. And we can debate the quality of those critiques, and we want. But what would happen is you'd have these policy documents that were written by government, which would go, Peter Tulip says this, here is a piece of work out of the RBA that makes this claim. Here is another claim made by an academic somewhere else that says that that's wrong. And I always used to refer to this, particularly when I was at the Productivity Commission, as the Pepsi and Coke problem, where Jon Stewart, the US comedian, he has this line where he's critiquing CNN, and he's like, the problem with CNN is they have pundits, they don't have analysts. And so it'd be like if you had cola wars being discussed, and you had a guy from Coke on, and you had a guy from Pepsi on. The guy from Coke says, I think we taste great. And the guy from Pepsi would say, no, I think we taste great. And then the host goes, well, there you have it. That's all the time we have, right? And so I think like a lot of the critiques that have existed in the past around this space kind of fell into that dichotomy, where you would have a piece of research would come out and then a critique would come out of it, and it doesn't really matter how strong the critique is. It's just then when you write your policy document in government, you recognize that there is a contested fact, and then you report it as a contested fact, and you don't adjudicate on that debate. You're like, that's all the time we have. Two smart people have come at this in different ways. And you see it all the time, right? Where it's like, the classic example is obviously unions versus businesses. Unions make one claim, businesses make another claim. Who knows, right? And so I think that that's kind of a real problem that we have in public policy in this country, is that we overvalue debate and not adjudicating on the debate and saying, because it requires some degree of capability, right? Like even right now, there is the big debate about markups. I don't know if you've seen a lot of this, but there was a paper published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics which said that markups have been rising across the US economy. A big critique came out of that paper that said that they've dropped a whole bunch of observations, and when you include them, markups haven't been rising a lot of the US economy, right? Now, I can tell you that there is a debate there, and the critique seems quite strong, but like to adjudicate that debate, I'd really have to get into the weeds, right, and really understand both of those papers in full. And so I'm kind of relying upon proxies adjudicating that debate, and that requires a lot of time, right? That requires someone really wanting to get into the weeds. And so I think a lot of these critiques come from that place, where it's like, if we can create a debate, then people have to adjudicate that debate. And, it creates problems, I suppose, where it's kind of like, how do we deal with this?
You're saying we're kind of at the point, between Auckland, Zurich, New York, we're kind of at the point where the evidence is pretty incontrovertible that supply side zoning reform, planning reform does genuinely help housing production and affordability, right?
I think we were there years and years ago. I think we were there 20 years ago. But I think the problem is that when I can plot a chart, which is like, here is the average in the rest of New Zealand that wasn't adopting zoning reforms. Here is Auckland. The two more or less track each other for 20 years. And then one goes above the other and stays above the other for 10 years. Like that's just a fact. Like you can't critique that. And so, we can kind of get into a lot of the weeds and we can kind of obfuscate a lot of these things. But I think that the fact that the argument has now been simplified to such a point where the point can be made so simply that it's not some abstract debate about, is average cost of land comparable to marginal cost of land? It's just literally line goes up. I think it's pretty incontrovertible, yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is understudied in Australia, and I think this reflects the fact that we have not had capacity in urban economics research kind of until recently, is that Melbourne and Sydney also tracked each other in terms of rents until early 90s. And then, Melbourne starts building in its CBD. Melbourne makes council amalgamations, all these sorts of changes, and they no longer track each other.
Sure.
And there are breaks there that I have not seen studied and that I think are worth studying. And I think that anyone listening to this podcast who's looking for a project should go back through that Melbourne data.
So it's a really interesting point, right? We have an urban economics reading group here run by myself, Dom Behrens, James Graham, and Peter Tulip. And we had this debate, I think, in our last meeting. There is a problem in this literature where we write these papers, particularly out of New Zealand. You send them off to economics journals. And the economics journal goes, like, why are you writing this? Water is wet. It's like you're saying that the supply curve slopes upwards, right? You're like saying a fact that is so obvious to economists, right? That like, why bother studying it? Like, you're not telling us anything we didn't already know about the world. And so there's a question about how important is Australian evidence in this space. And it's a genuinely quite interesting discussion, which is like, I'm currently mucking around with some work in Australia in this space. It probably won't publish unbelievably highly because it's just like, here is what we already know, but in a different context.
Australian water is
also wet, right? Exactly. But is that a rhetorically powerful thing to policymakers here locally? I think for sure.
I think so.
And so, I think that people like knowing their water is wet here as well.
I think that's right. And I think that goes like nicely into what you talk about at the beginning of your piece, which is around the PR problem of supply-side policy, but also a PR problem in Australian policy, which is that we kind of have this parochial view of ourselves.
Sure.
And and the entire thesis of Inflection Points is that we are different from the US. We are different from the UK. We are our own thing. But some things do apply across. And one of those things is that economists tend to, and Australians and people tend to default to demand-side explanations, right? You open with, and you mentioned briefly, Stephen Levitt's shrimponomics thought experiment, right? The idea that, you ask people, why do people consume more shrimp? And they think of demand-side explanations, but the actual main explainer is the fact that we got better at farming shrimp and there's more shrimp. You argue that this cognitive bias leads policymakers to kind of consistently reach for pretty questionable levers. What's an example of housing policy that feels intuitive but kind of gets things backwards?
So the obvious one that always people refer to are first home buyer grants, right? Where it's you want to help some people buy a home, young people buy a home, we'll just give them some more money to do so. You can kind of understand where that comes from, right? Where it's you want to help someone buy something, just give them some more money to help buy it. We see this in a lot of other sectors as well, particularly at the moment, right? Childcare is obviously a really big one. Childcare is expensive. We need to increase the subsidy, right? And maybe that does help. I'm sure it does help. But it also runs up against a constrained sector, right? And so that's kind of what hopefully economists recognize is that, when a market's constrained and you just give people more money to buy things, then you just increase the price of it, right? And that doesn't particularly help the problem. And so I think that, we reach for these levers far too often because they're a good, number one, they're a good announceable. Number two, there are a lot of markets where demand side is a problem and you need to help people on that side of the market.
What's an example of a market where a demand side fix is useful?
So education is obviously the classic one, higher education. You look at the HECS help reforms and that we implemented in the 90s. Hugely influential demand side policy that made Australia work a lot better in terms of that. Because the problem there is a classic one where it's I would like to pay for education, I'd benefit from it, but I don't have enough money for it right now. I'd have money for it over my life cycle, would be better off over the lifetime. And so the government steps in and they give me a loan, right? And that's a demand-side policy. That's solved the market failure where it's if you want to get technical, it's you can't, mortgage your human capital or whatever, right? So, that's obviously one where we've had huge success in terms of making higher education available to people by giving them some support on a loan and things like that.
Yeah, and getting them on the demand side. That's such a great example. I think one of the big problems in supply policy, and you summarize this, and I'll quote you to you, which is, I'm sure delightful, but no one sees the price that, thanks to greater supply, never rose in the first place, right? It's part of why, again, that Auckland story is good, because you see the tick up in approvals, right? And you can, as you do on your blog, One Final Effort, you can show pictures of the developments that are happening, right? Yeah. And we're seeing this in Melbourne now, that there are many townhouses being built under the new townhouse code reforms, right? We're seeing them go through. And that's exciting, because you can point to real things in the real world. But the invisibility of many supply-side gains, is that part of why the reform is kind of harder to go to, rather than like, here's $10,000 for a new home?
Yeah, 100%. So there are a couple of things about this, right? So the first is that to know that a supply-side reform had an impact, you probably need some applied microeconomic study. Right now, you look at the raw data in Auckland, and real rents are lower than they were at the time of the reform, and they've diverged massively from the rest of the country, right? And it's like, okay, that seems to be an impact of these reforms. But it could be something else. It could be something else. It could be something else. And people who don't believe that study and that work say, oh, it's changes in migration or population growth or what have you, right? To confirm that, you need to do something a bit more sophisticated. So it's like when prices don't rise as much as they would otherwise, there are a bunch of explanations as to why that might be the case. First of all, it's not clear that prices haven't risen as much as they would otherwise. But second of all, it's like, well, why haven't they risen as much as they would have otherwise? People just can't, understandably, they can't grapple with that. Then you have a political economy problem. That's the second point, is that if you imagine right now that governments adopt massive supply-side reform in the housing market, or even in energy or another sector, right? This stuff's going to take 2, 3, 4 years to build. Then rents are going to start to grow more slowly than they would otherwise. Energy prices would grow more slowly than they would otherwise. By then, you've had another election, right? Because we have a 3-year electoral cycle. And it's like, even if it was a 5-year electoral cycle, these things don't happen immediately, right? So government tells you, we've done a bunch of things to make your life better, but you won't see that for 5 years, right? Or 4 years or 3 years. Why do the reform from a political point of view, right? Whereas the demand side thing, the reforms to childcare subsidies, the 20% HEX cut recently just happened. I just got a text about that yesterday.
Yes, so did I.
Yeah. That's something that government tells you they're doing now, and they can point to that right now. Whereas supply-side reform requires you to believe that things will get better slowly over time. And that's a real big political economy problem.
And it also gets us back to that mathematics problem too, where you have to do a microeconomic study. You have to explain, look, adjusting for this, if we hadn't built all these homes, your rent would have gone up more. People don't internalize inflation. So they're going like, well, no, my rent is higher. So even if it's lower than, inflation, it's still higher in nominal terms.
100%, yeah.
That's how people think.
Yeah.
And that's reasonable, right? Most people aren't trained, aren't, spending their days thinking, well, in terms of the counterfactual. I don't walk around thinking about, the counterfactual in every moment of my life, probably more than I should. Sure. But
are you a cricket man?
Let's pretend I am.
There's a saying in cricket about wicket keepers. It's like, when you have a good wicket keeper, you don't notice.
Yeah.
Right. And so we had when we were recording this, we had a test match that ended a couple of days ago where the Australian wicketkeeper Alex Carey played an unbelievable game. And you really noticed. And that's a really rare thing. But I think the same's true about supply side reforms, or the supply side of the market, or productivity even more generally. But it's going well, you don't notice. You're not complaining about prices being high. You're not complaining about long lines, to get a rental property or whatever, right? You just go about your life. And you don't. Why would you notice?
For a little bit of inside baseball, as it were, you put a bunch of sports metaphors in your essay. And let me tell you, am I a cricket man? Let's just say one of the other editors handled those.
Sure, fair enough.
But yeah, I think that's exactly right. The thing that is invisible is often the most effective thing. It's the same in CGI, for instance, right? A lot of standard dramas are actually doing compositing all the time. The best example of that is The Social Network, where Armie Hammer is playing both twins, but there's someone else there, and his face is CGI'd onto the other twin for the whole film.
Yeah.
And you would have no idea. You would have no idea watching that.
Yeah.
And that's what kind of makes that one of the best pieces of CGI ever. So I think that's exactly right. It's what you don't see. And that's what makes it kind of so hard, both from a convincing policymakers who might be skeptical or might be motivated because they're working in an area of policy that benefits from this reform not happening, it does make it kind of a bit more of an uphill battle to do the supply side reforms rather than just say, and we've designated some number of homes to be, quote unquote affordable.
Sure.
Let's move over to your 3 principles. The first one that you bring up is this, that reforms should target bans, not burdens. You define burdens as things that make processes slower or costlier, wait times, documentation, reporting, permits, etc. But bans are rules that prevent activity altogether. Why is this distinction kind of so important?
So to start with the housing example, it's just where the weight of evidence is. So it's kind of this funny thing where we've really started the conversation about housing supply in this country over the past 10 years, right? And so, you read an article where some housing minister in some state department is talking about, we want to do supply side reform. And their heart's in the right place. And they really are trying to do good policy for the public, right? And then you read the news article about what they're doing, and it's like, okay, you're going after approval times, infrastructure costs that developers have to pay, speed at which government runs. And you look at these kinds of things and you go, that's all well and good. And those maybe are on net good reforms. But it's like, hey, it's still illegal to build housing in much of the country, right? And so it's kind of this question where, one of the papers that I wrote was about a city called Lower Hutt, right, which is a city in New Zealand. It's about 15 minutes outside of Wellington by car. And, they adopted some reforms in the mid-2010s, which, tried to make it easier for developers to build, to interact with government, the costs that they had interacting with government. There's just no response in terms of, you look over the period, housing did not go up. And it's like, well, why? It's like, well, because everywhere in the city, it's illegal to build housing, except for on the urban fringe, where you can build detached housing. And so, we spoke about this right before, where you have 5 or 6 studies now, which all go, this place legalized building more housing. They got rid of the bans on medium density or high density or whatever, and they built more. But how many studies are there that say that, if you cut down the wait times, if you cut down the amount of documents that you have to complete in the housing space, that the city then just built a lot more housing, right? And so you start with that premise and you kind of go, okay, what drives that gap in evidence? Is it the fact that this is just a true fact about the world, or have people just understudied these problems? But then you look at the kind of political economy of it and you're like, well, if I'm a business and there was good evidence that, or like a business lobby group or what have you, and there was good evidence that did exist, that this place cut down approval wait times, they shortened documentation, and we got a lot more built, I would produce that report and I would show the world about it, right? But it just doesn't exist. So you start with that premise and you kind of go, okay, the evidence base points us one way over the other, right? And then you look at kind of the big microeconomic reforms that have happened in this country over the past 50 years, right? And they're all things that changed the way that the market operated fundamentally. They're not things that tinker around the margin, right? These are things like removing price controls in some parts of the economy, removing tariffs. These are big things that change the structure of how markets operate, financial capital controls, floating the dollar. These are all really big things that result in new firms coming in. They result in, a whole bunch of creative destruction and all that good stuff. And so to put it a bit more technically, all these things in terms of burdens, they're kind of, I suppose, potential marginal cost stories where it's like, okay, it costs me an extra $5 to $10, to produce another unit of output. But these big bans on things, they just stop you from coming in full stop, right? And so it's kind of this entry barrier to a lot of economic activity going in the first place, right?
So if supply side effects are invisible either way, why are politicians constantly reaching for burdens rather than bans? Is it just political ease, or?
So it's partly political ease. It's partly that the cost of these things fall on government, where, if you're making government work a bit faster or you have to fill out fewer forms or what have you, then, that falls on the regulator in terms of they have to, bear the costs of working faster or not feeling like they've done their due diligence or what have you. But I also think I think a lot of these people are operating in good faith as well, right? Where it's just there isn't as much of an evidence base on supply side policy generally. And there are a bunch of interesting reasons why that could be true. One reason could be that we have very good data on households. And so on the demand side of the economy, we have a lot of really good evidence. But we haven't had really good evidence on firms, like data sets on firms and kind of the supply side of markets until pretty recently. And so if I'm a policymaker and people are telling me in energy or in childcare or in housing that supply is a really big issue, and I want to, in good faith, go out and increase supply in that part of the economy, like what do I have to go on? Like, what can I announce? And it's like, well, you've got what the business groups have told you, which is that you have a lot of burden on them operating, which a lot of it is probably true. And that's a point that I try and make throughout the piece as well. Is I'm not saying
this is your second principle.
Yeah.
Which you're jumping the gun here.
Okay, sorry.
So I'm gonna no. I'm gonna frame it up because your second principle is exactly this: that we need to think about markets rather than individual firms, right? When Auckland upzoned, you show there's now sort of this way a decade later, 4,245 more construction firms than before the reform, right? Sure. And those firms are on average 60% bigger, right?
Yeah.
So you write, the firms who can best describe the potential gains from liberalization have no voice in the policymaking process under the status quo. This feels like a fundamental problem for how we design policy.
Yes.
How do you consult firms that don't exist yet, or is consultation holding us back in this way?
It's a good question. So consultation, I think, is obviously good for a couple of reasons. Like, you want people to buy into things, and if people aren't going to buy into things if you've never spoken to them about it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that it's also useful to get kind of a lay of a land, right? Which is kind of like, you want to understand at least what's going on, right? So when I was at the Productivity Commission, you'd be put on to report about vocational education and training, let's say. Like, I worked on that report. I have no idea about the vocational education and training sector. I've never thought about it before in my life. What's a good first way to get your head around it? It's like, okay, you talk to, the unions, you talk to education providers, you talk to business groups. And so you get kind of a lay of the land, right? And so consultation is useful in that sense, right? But then you run into this problem where you're operating within the rules of the game insofar as what they are. And so it's kind of this bizarre thing where, for example, the work that the Grattan Institute put out really recently, talking about we should allow medium density across our major cities. And then you see these people that say stuff like, oh, I spoke to a developer and they said that, like, there's not a market for that, or I wouldn't build it. And you kind of look at that and you kind of go a couple of questions. You're like, well, number one, this developer builds detached houses on the urban fringe. This is undercutting their business as it currently exists. And even if it doesn't, even if they're like, I would pivot into the medium density market if this policy was actually enacted, that's a risk for that business, right? They might lose their market share. They might go out of business altogether. It's like, they're doing fine under the status quo. Why would they risk all of their business?
Right. And the thing that would improve it under the status quo would be removal of whatever burden they're facing right now.
Exactly, yeah. Because right now they're interacting with government, and government's approving, their dwelling approval on the urban fringe, or they bought up a block of land outside of, an urban growth boundary, and they want that to be changed from rural to residential. That would make their business a lot better, right? Will that help the overall Australian community? It's debatable, right? And there's a conversation to be had there. But why would we expect these firms to have done the work and, even just conceptualizing it, right? Where it's like, I'm a developer that builds houses on the urban fringe. Why would I put resources towards understanding what my market would look like and how my business would operate if Sydney allowed medium density housing throughout the city? Why would I do that? That's a waste of my time, right? That's some hypothetical that I don't really need to understand, right? And so you don't have the resources being put into it by these businesses, because why would they? And so when you go speak to them, it's kind of like, well, what does this tell you? It tells you their private incentives, and it tells you how they understand the status quo, right? It kind of be like if you were trying to make the AFL more exciting and you went and spoke to Richmond Football Club about how can we make the AFL more exciting? They might have good ideas, but their interest is winning the comp. They're focusing on the current state of play, right? If you ask them, if we added 3 or 4 more clubs, would that make the AFL more exciting? Well, it's like, okay, maybe it would, but maybe that changes our likelihood of making finals each year. Maybe it changes our ability to compete for players on the market. Maybe they siphon off some of our fans. So you have these kind of incentives that work in different directions, right? And so, when you go and you consult, you get a bit from column A, you get a bit from column B, you get genuinely good ideas, but you get a lack of imagination for what the world could look like, and you get a bit of private incentives, right? And I'm not criticizing them for doing that, because
no, it's rational.
It's rational, and these are,
and it's not their job.
It's not their job, and often these people are good faith people. They want to make the country better. But why are we taking what they say at face value, right?
And as gospel truth,
right? It's kind of strange, and you kind of understand why it happens, but I'd like to see it happen a little bit less.
Yeah, how do you build structures where we are kind of saying like, well, yeah, all these people are saying it, but we know there's this overwhelming academic body of literature, or we know the top line numbers tell us this. Mm-hmm. How do you kind of bring industry along? You say like consultation is important because it gets buy-in, et cetera. How do you bring them along for the ride when they are missing the kind of biggest bang for buck kind of stuff? And like you say, hey, we're going to do XYZ thing that you think will help you and we think will help you. But the big bang for buck is thing number delta that like is just bizarre to the developer, like not relevant to kind of anything that they've said in the consultation. How do you still bring them along when we have framed so much of our policy development in this sort of consultative cycle?
It's a really good question. And it's one I'm actually going to throw back at you. As a YIMBY Melbourne guy, because, okay, here's where my brain went with this, right?
Yeah.
Which is that we want to build your mission at YIMBY Melbourne. We want to build more housing within existing suburbs. We've consulted with existing residents, and we've done all we can. We've tried to explain to them all the benefits of this or whatever, and they still just they're not buying in, right? What do you do then? Like, you've done your consultation. They still don't want it. You've explained to them all you can. You can do more consultation, but people have dug their heels in. Like, what do you do? Do you just go, okay, we're just going to go ahead with it anyway, we don't need to bring you along? Or do you do something else?
I mean, I think to a point, like, you do just have to kind of do the thing that you know will be good, right? That's kind of the job of policy, right? It's why we don't do like direct democracy on like trade policy, right? It would be an immediate disaster. So yeah, I think you consult with people to like understand local context, like you were saying, or industry context, and you graft what you can that is important there. But at the end of the day, like, and this is where kind of local decision making is like so fraught. And I guess we can like take the metaphor of local decision making and incumbent resident decision making and apply it to incumbent industry decision making, which is we gather the information. We weigh that information, but then we ultimately say like, well, at what level are the benefits of these changes localized? And they're not localized, actually. They are broad.
Yes.
Right? They're broad because better functioning markets is a better functioning country. Mm-hmm. More housing in Boroondara or in Waverley Council is better for the country. And so we push ahead with it anyway. And I guess what you're getting me to tease out here is that we kind of have to do that same mindset, but for existing industry.
Yeah. And
even though they're not geographically located.
And look, I think if you were going to have a critique of my argument or my piece, it's mainly for length and a variety of other things. You can't caveat everything. Is that, people lose from policy, and we shouldn't diminish that. If you have a change to an industrial structure, you have some reforms where, the market's going to change. Some firms are going to die. Some new firms are going to come in. That means some people are going to lose their jobs, right? That means some people are going to lose their businesses, right? And we shouldn't diminish that, right? And we can still weigh up, as you articulated really well, that like the benefits are, large and they're spread across the community and it's worth doing. But we shouldn't, pretend that some people aren't going to be affected negatively by it. And there is a good question about how we go about compensating those people and whether we do, number one, and then how do we go about it when we do so, because you don't want to create a system where there is big backlash to changes, right? Where we go and adopt a bunch of reforms and then a bunch of people lose and you create kind of a resentful part of the population.
Right, exactly. This is something I'm working on a little bit in the background with Howard McLean of Greater Canberra, which is how do we renew an Australian social contract, especially for living in the city? And I think about this all the time, being in Sydney, which really brings out my most YIMBY, which is where you're walking around the city of Sydney and on every site on every sign it says, Sydney, a city of villages. And it's like, you're not a city of villages. We're in the CBD. This is a deeply unserious self-conception, right? Mm-hmm. And it's a big problem if you think you can live in a village, but also get all the advantages of living in what is essentially the center of Australia's economy. Mm. And the question is how do you redraw and renew a social contract that sort of says to live in the city or to live in a country is to live in a place that changes and is to sometimes lose a little so that we as a nation can win big. Yeah. I think Dan Wang grapples with this really well in his book Breakneck about the differences between China and the US. It grapples with this in terms of China as a place that does just send it, as we kind of put it, right? Yeah. And he really grapples with the trade-offs there, and he lands on sort of the US needs to do more, but there are risks to becoming fully like China and fully autocratic and fully just willing to rampage over people's rights and people's well-being and just completely democratically dismiss them. But I do think that the redefining that social contract is one of the most important things. And I think one of the interesting things that you've kind of just raised here, which is that also exists at a firm level, because sometimes policy will kill you. Tariff reform would have, I'm sure, killed many, many, many businesses that I have never heard of.
Yeah. And businesses are, people within them, right?
Corporations are people?
Corporations are people, as Mitt Romney famously once said. But, we put out some work here at E61 on what happens when a coal-fired power plant or coal business closes and the effects that has on their workers. And those are things that we shouldn't dismiss, I suppose. And I suppose the other part to it, which is kind of interesting, is something I do wonder about and I'm a bit concerned about, where I think there is potentially a narrative that's forming amongst young people, kind of, Gen Z and millennials. This is the narrative. I'm saying whether it's true or not, but this is the narrative, is that this generation has been screwed over by policy. Housing's really unaffordable. The tax system's set up in a way where it's really discouraged investment in labor and kind of earning money through wages. And, climate change is going on. And there's all these kind of big existential threats. And so that justifies policy which is bad for the country, but redistributes to us. And I look at the HECS debt cut as kind of a recent example of this.
Yeah, one of our more embarrassing policy decisions of the last.
Well, look, the Australian community voted for that policy. And economists tell you about what you can optimize over, I suppose. But at the end of the day, government does policy as a reflection of community values, right? And so there's actually a bit of work that me and Jack Buckley did here at E61, which was conditional that you want to cut student debt. How might you go about that in a slightly better way, right? And so that was what we put forward. But, when I spoke to some people about that reform, they were kind of like, yeah, I know it's a bad reform, but young people have gotten screwed. And so therefore I don't care. I'm happy to tolerate reform that makes things worse off, but at least we get some of ours. Because, boomers and older people have gotten away with the loot. And so if we can just grab some of that, that's fine. And at some point that mentality needs to stop. At some point, and you look at this in kind of a lot of our conversations we have today, where it's at some point you need to say, I have to accept that I will sometimes lose for the better of everyone else. And to your point about rewriting that social contract, that's something that we haven't done in this country in 15 or 20 years. And so it's fallen out of our understanding of how politics and policy might work and ought work, which is I don't have to be compensated for everything as long as overall the pie keeps growing and we redistribute it somewhat fairly.
Right. This is one of the things that your boss, Michael Brennan, said when we launched this publication back in July, which was that, the biggest sin is not the hoarding of the pie, it's the hiding of the recipe.
Sure.
Which I quite like as a metaphor. This idea that kind of the biggest problem is the areas where growth and supply has been most heavily constrained. And, you look at housing in particular, right? When you look at, costs of goods, the fact that, iPhones are relatively cheap even compared to when they launch, especially for the compute power that they have and so on. We are materially wealthy, but the core things that are most important, particularly, housing and to a lesser extent, but still to an extent, education, much, much, much more expensive than we would expect or than we would hope if you were to say, well, everything should get cheaper over time. Everything should get better.
Yeah.
And that comes down to a distribution of opportunity often as much as if not more than, a redistribution of like cash or of wealth. And that comes down to where I think these systemic reforms and these supply side reforms are actually going to be much more impactful for young people than tax redistribution, which obviously I'm also very much in favor of, and we'll be publishing some really great stuff, I think, on tax reform in 2026.
Yeah, hopefully. It's kind of this interesting thing as well where we spoke actually, like, it's kind of a joke at the Productivity Commission where I worked there, where it's like you do a policy which is going to make things better, but it's going to make some people worse off. And it's like, you just increase the rate of job seeker. Just give like, that might be the optimal policy mix, which is like we just grow the pie and then we just redistribute it through the tax transfer system, right? And so there is this problem potentially where you want every policy to be Pareto improving. No one's worse off. But it's like, okay, this policy is going to make you worse off, but then fine, we'll just give you more money over here. And we'll just do both as efficiently as we possibly can. But that requires people to abstract away from, I'm being hurt by this particular policy, but overall I'll be better off because of what's happening elsewhere. And that requires people to kind of buy into that social contract.
Right. This was something that I think came up in a conversation your colleague Matt Nolan had with Steve Hamilton, which is that we often forget that we have a tax and transfer system, 100%. Right?
Yeah.
And that both are really important to think about, because when you think about both of them, your conception of how egalitarian Australia is actually differs really wildly if you look at only one of those two things. Which is really interesting. But this is not a discussion about tax.
No. We can talk about tax some other time.
We can talk about tax some other time. I want to get to the final principle in the article, which is controlling the inputs, monitoring the outputs, or controlling the controllables.
Sure.
You argue that we kind of are using the wrong metrics when we're thinking about kind of, is a housing policy successful, whether we're building quote unquote enough.
Yeah.
What's the problem with targets for outputs in terms of measuring the efficacy of a policy?
So I think I have in the piece that, like, I don't mind targets for outputs, provided that they are, I remember the exact words I used, but like if they're a guide rather than they are like, we have to hit this.
They're an expression of values.
Expression of values. Yeah, exactly. Where it's like, I want Australia to build more housing. We think that this is probably a good, in the long run, all else equal, this would be a reflection of that value. And so we'd like to get towards that. The problem that people have is that they treat these things as like gospel, or they treat these things as like, this is what the government said they're going to do, so therefore they're going to go do it, right? It's kind of funny, when I was at the PC, I worked on a variety of national agreements, and these national agreements always have targets, right? And the targets are like, we want X% of the population to have a vocational degree, or we want to cut this bad thing to 10% from 15% or what have you, right? And then you kind of look and one government signs up to it, and then 3 years later they get ousted and a new government comes in and they're kind of like, well, we didn't meet the target, but that's because the previous government had bad policy, not us. So now we're setting another target or whatever. And it's kind of like, what are we really achieving here? Because it's like, okay, we have a recession, let's say. And it's like, okay, all of a sudden we're not going to hit our targets. But that's not your fault as a government, right? It's like you had a recession. Like, you have a war somewhere, you have a pandemic, the financial sector collapses in another country. It's like all of a sudden you're not gonna hit your target. It's like, okay. But like that's not something that we should be angry at government about, because government could still be doing better than they could otherwise, right? And so I think targets really work when they're, as I say, they're expression of values. So it's like in the long run, all else equal, if we don't have a recession, if we don't have these bad things, we probably want to be around here. It's kind of like when you get a new coach into your team, where it's like, I want to win the league in the next 3 years. And then they don't win the league. They lose the final by 5 points. And you go, okay, you didn't hit your target. It's like, well, no, like,
we got to the final.
We did pretty well.
Yeah.
But it's like, it told you when this guy comes in as the coach, it's like, do you want to finish mid-table? Do you want to like rebuild? Or do you want to go for glory, right? And that tells people like what your objective is and what you want to try and achieve, right? But they're not this perfect measure of output, right?
Yeah, you sort of lay out the kind of on, like, for instance, the current 1.2 million homes target. Yeah, you say it's an expression of values, a statement of intent about the economy we want. what does a bad target look like? Like, what does bad targeting look like in these kind of policy circumstances?
So the problem is that, like, you know, if you set a target that's too low, people will criticize you. So I think when the government first set the target, I might be misremembering this, but I think they first set it at 1 million. And then they got some criticism that it was like,
I think 1 million was like the baseline.
Yeah. But then they were like, people are like, we built that over the 2010s. Like, that's not whatever. So then they up it. And so sometimes these targets you see, they're just like, they call them ambitious targets, but it's like, okay, this is never going to be hit. And then that's maybe a bit of an announceable, and it's kind of looks good. So you're kind of playing this game where you want to set something that people are going to think, oh, like, you know, you're going to have to do a bit to get to that. But, you know, not something that is so far out of reach. I understand why they might be good to signal to the public, and so there might be a political tool that's effective, but I personally don't particularly think that they are effective policy tools.
Yeah, so if we're then thinking about housing, the inputs that the government can control, obviously zoning and the bans are one of those inputs. What are the other kind of inputs that we should be thinking about?
Well, so you look at right now what's happening. It's like, okay, we have high construction costs that went up a lot over the pandemic, and they're really high in levels. And they're kind of growing slowly now, so eventually kind of overall price levels and wages and all these other things are going to catch up, but they're still elevated. We had a rate cutting cycle, but now that's probably stalled, if not over. And so you're going to have kind of interest rates at their current level, the cash rate at its current level. Those are kind of the really big factors that are preventing new housing from being built that are outside of government, right? And so you look at that and you say, okay, like, all else equal, what do we have? And it's like, okay, we have zoning and land use planning. Maybe we have some stuff we can do around the margins on infrastructure. Maybe there's some stuff we can do on migration in terms of getting, you know, skilled workers in and things like this. But we're kind of in an environment that's not necessarily favorable to these things, right? Not favorable to having record-setting dwelling approvals or whatever, right? And so you look at that and you kind of go, okay, so what can we do? We can put our hands up and say we're not going to build that much because construction costs are high and interest rates are elevated. And so, like, there's not much we can do, whatever. Or you can say, like, let's have this trough or this little period where we're not doing as much as we could do in our total output and just go a little bit higher. And then over the next couple of years, once these things reverse, then we can really try and take off.
Yeah, and I think we can kind of land this pretty nicely with sort of observations going back to Auckland, which is New Zealand's had a recession as well. New Zealand has been affected by these global construction cost changes. But even in the worst year, Auckland's construction between 22 and 2024 ranked as the fourth best year out of the previous 17, right? They've raised the floor.
Yeah.
Why is raising the floor way more important than raising the ceiling for policymakers?
Can I give another sports metaphor?
For sure.
Yeah.
You've not even used your full allocation.
So there's a story when Australia tours England for the Ashes, right? I think this was in the 2019 or maybe the 2023 tour. I think it was 2019. And essentially what had happened on the previous couple of times Australia had been to England was they'd played well, they'd played good cricket, and then in one session they would lose 6 wickets or they get bowled out in one session, right? And then the test is done. One like mindset you could have about that could be, let's just not do that. But it's like, hey, we live in the real world. Shit happens. Like, you know, you're going to go through bad times, right? You can lose a test in a session, which is what they were doing the last time they came. But then they spoke about on that 2019 tour, and there's a quote from Steve Ward, one of the coaches at the time. He was like, look, let's just try and lose 3 or 4 wickets in that session. So it's still a bad session. Like, it's still going to look bad. It looks like we've done bad in that session. But the counterfactual is we're out of the game. And I think that's how we should think about raising the floor, right? Is that, like, you know, you look at what's happened in terms of real incomes over the past couple of years where they've dropped a lot. They're going to take a while to get back to kind of the previous trend. And so you lose a lot in a society when you have these really big negative bad outcomes when the business cycle goes down or whatever. And so what happened in Auckland, for example, is when you look at the GFC around that period, building dropped to basically nothing. And so you look at what happened to rents after that, just went way up. House prices went way up. And it's like, okay, we can't control the cycle, but because we had policy settings that were restrictive for allowing housing supply, we had really, really bad outcomes that we took 10 years to unwind, right? It took us 10 years to kind of get back to the previous level of affordability in terms of rents. And so it's like, okay, you want to lose those sessions small. You want to try and not lose the whole game right there. And the hard part is that it still looks bad. There's still a news article that says things have gotten worse, but the counterfactual is things would have gotten a lot worse. Yeah. And so no government really gets credit for things getting worse, but things not getting a lot worse. Like, even look at like how we weathered the GFC. We weathered it a lot better than other countries, right? And then it meant that, our labor market recovered far quicker throughout the 2010s. A lot more people were employed. Whereas look at a lot of European countries, like they had elevated unemployment for a decade, right? It's kind of this quiet, uncelebrated work of policy, which is like, when things go bad, make sure they don't go really, really bad, because that's when you take ages to return to what things could have been previously.
Right. And that's kind of a way of like, we think about like a social safety net. And in a way, we kind of want to set other policies that aren't just sort of a safety net, but like are a safety raised floor.
Yeah,
absolutely. It's like a kind of clumsy metaphor there.
And sorry, the other thing is the inverse of that is that when people talk about, for example, the 2010s, and they're like, well, we're building a lot of housing over the 2010s. Sure, that's true. But like, what if we built even more over that period, right?
Right.
Then maybe during the pandemic, maybe rents would have gone up, but they wouldn't have gone up, or post-pandemic, they wouldn't have gone up anywhere near as much. And so it's not just about raising the floor, but you also want to make hay on the good times as well, right?
This is particularly where I think there's just so much comparative work to be done between Melbourne and Sydney.
Sure.
Particularly on that 2010 period where both had a boom, but one had a much larger boom and a much larger inner city boom.
Yeah.
There's a beautiful line at the end of your essay. Supply side stories take imagination. They require us to picture the world not as it is, but as it could be. Mm-hmm. And it could be so much better than it is. I fully agree. I think that encapsulates exactly what we're trying to talk about here in terms of Australia at Inflection Points. I think it also captures the challenges of supply side reform. But paint that picture for us. What does Australia look like if we get this right?
Well, the whole point is we don't know. Like, that's the whole point. It takes imagination. I'll just say something quickly on that line, which I think is really interesting. One of my colleagues, he's now at the University of Santa Barbara, Zachariah Hayward, who gets a shout out actually in the piece. He wrote an op-ed in The Australian a couple of months ago, where he was kind of like, look, Australia is this awesome country. Like, what a great country we live in. It was published in The Australian, the op-ed section, and we were reading the comments on it, right? And The Australian, they have an older demographic, to put it a certain way. And people loved it. All these people were like, it's great to read from a young person who's articulating a vision of optimism, who believes in this country, who believes that things are good and they can get better. And it was kind of interesting, right? Because particularly in the opinion section of a major newspaper, you usually just get doom and gloom.
Totally.
And so I think that one of the things that people have spoken to me about the piece is they've said they liked that optimism. I think that that's something that we ought sell more, which is that when people talk about, reducing demand, for instance, which in some cases you should, you're inherently articulating that we ought go backwards to some extent. And sometimes, again, you should, but things can be better. And the vision that like we can keep having more and we can keep doing more and things can keep getting better and we don't need to ration the pie, we can just keep growing it, is kind of this more optimistic, more, I think, version of the future that I think more people would want to buy into in the long run. And so in terms of what a better Australia looks like, I think there are huge opportunities in this country. We are we have a very stable system of government. We have a very good election system. Our institutions are pretty good. I think the Justin Wolfer's speech recently kind of made that case.
Yep.
We obviously have a beautiful natural landscape in this country. We have pretty good weather. So people should want to come here. We have good universities and things like that as well. So I think a better Australia or a better world looks like a world for us where we can take in lots of smart people. We can have them doing great research, building great businesses. We have really great cities. I think those cities get bigger and they fit more people and we get more bands, more musicians, more artists, and kind of really make the most of that. Like, we have awesome classical music organizations and stuff like that. So we should really steer into that. I'd like us to win the World Cup, like the FIFA World Cup. Mm-hmm. And like, I think we're getting better and I'd like to see us get even better. And that requires more people. It requires, real investment in the future and kind of allowing people to reach their full potential. I think there is huge opportunities in in things like green energy, where we have a lot of sun, a lot of wind, and all these types of things. So like there are things that come along with that. So I think like it just looks like a country that has a lot going for it. We really sell those types of things. You know, people talk about like, for example, UNSW being like Harvard University on the beach, right? Like it's a pretty great location and smart people should want to come here. And for them to come here, we need to be able to take them. We need to be able to build housing for them. We need to be able to get energy for them. We need to be able to look after them when they get old. And so to really take advantage of our natural strengths, we need to sort out a lot of these supply constrained parts of the economy, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something one of our editors at Inflection Points, Luke Heaney, has written about, is that the greatest arbitrage in Australian policy is to simply brain drain America. We are the only country in the world with net migration into Australia from America rather than out.
Yeah.
And we should be juicing the hell out of that given the current circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely.
Particularly with, funding for research institutions and so on. Like Australia should become an R&D capital.
Yeah. And like the reason why I started my answer by like, we don't know, is to some extent it's a values question. Australia is kind of pretty unique in terms of a lot of dimensions. And so we can pivot quite widely. You know, we can be a real high growth economy. We can be pivot into being a bit more of a social safety net economy. It just requires people to articulate a vision for like what we ought be. And conditional on like we all get on board, we can pivot to a variety of different things. We can be an R&D capital. We can pivot more into green energy. We can pivot more into services and kind of things like that as well. So there is just like a lot that we can do. We just need to move somewhere. We need to kind of say, I want to go here and let's get there.
Yeah, absolutely. Second to last question of the show. What areas of reform, you've looked at housing, what areas of reform should supply side thinkers maybe be looking at closely next if you were to pick something off the rank?
So the care sector is fascinating, right? Because it's gone from being a big part of our economy to the biggest part of our economy. When you look at the labor market right now, where people are moving into jobs, it's almost all care. So there's a trap that people fall into where they kind of go, well, that's just all government. And it's like it is to some extent, but it's like people are getting older, people are getting richer. So what happens when those two things are true? People want more care, right? And it's also a values thing where it's like, I think as we get richer as a country, we should look after our disabled and our elderly and our children a lot better. And so it's like, okay, we want more of this stuff, either through government or just through demographics or whatever. And no one has a clue how we expand that part of our economy. At the moment, it's like, okay, we'll subsidize it. You know, with the NDIS, we're trying to set up a market from scratch. And there isn't a zoning reform in care where it's like, hey, like, look at this. You can do this and you can get a lot better care. That requires a lot of serious thought that we just haven't done yet. And it's going to be really, really important over the next 10 years because otherwise it's just going to be pulling in more and more and more workers, and expansion of that part of the economy is just going to be kind of more people flowing into it to kind of provide those services. So I'm not quite sure what that reform specifically looks like, but it needs a lot of serious thought, I think, going forward.
Yeah, and all the more reason for people to be looking into it. I encourage people to take a look at Jade Lynn's essay in Inflection Points, which sort of looks at, some of the troubles with how these markets have been constructed that kind of weighted much more towards inputs rather than outputs in a way that actually is problematic in kind of a different frame from how you're talking about inputs and outputs here.
Sure.
Final question of the show, as always. What's one thing you think more people should know about how Australia works?
I think people should know that our Bureau of Statistics is awesome and that Australia is basically a world leader now in microdata. I don't know if anyone's spoken about this before on your platform, but essentially the story is that for a while, Scandinavia just had this awesome data where they had information on, people come in and present here, for example, and they have like people's IQs linked to their tax records, linked to, a whole variety of their health records and things like that. And so Scandinavia, if you look at like kind of the top publications in economics over the past 10, 15 years, so many of them just have a random Scandinavian
data set.
Data set. And so our Bureau of Statistics has done a lot of work over the past 10 to 15 years investing in comparable data. And it's still not perfect, but it's getting a lot better. And it's now kind of the point where a lot of people are looking at Australia and they're going, like, I could work on their data because they just have such good available data. And to return to the conversation we were just having in terms of brain draining other countries, look, smart people going, hey, we have really good data in Australia. It's a great place to live. Like, I can go research there, right? And so I think people should know about that because it's becoming quite a bit of a comparative advantage that we have, number one. And then number two, I think that if I was a policymaker and I had a spare couple million to throw around, I'd throw it at the Bureau of Statistics and I just get more people producing more of this data sets. Because to return to kind of the overall thesis of my piece and like imagining a better future, that requires someone to do that work. You know, in terms of getting care sector productivity up or improving that, the way that probably will happen is someone will do some really awesome work using some sophisticated data, being like, hey, it turns out that like these kinds of businesses are more productive, or this reform over here led to a lot of, you know, really great outcomes. Someone needs to do that work, but you need to have the data. We're putting that data together. Investing in that like really unlocks a lot of kind of knowledge that we can have. And so I think people should know about that. And if for somehow we can make that a political issue or an electoral issue to be like, fund the ABS even more and really steer into that, I think that would be a really good outcome for Australia.
I think an election where the key topic is how many boffins we have.
Yeah, exactly.
would be a shining thing for our nation. Matt, thank you so much. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Inflection Points Podcast, a production of Inflection Points Publishing, including me, Jonathan O'Brien, as well as Ethan Gilbert and Manning Clifford. Our music is by Isha Ramdas, who also provides additional engineering support. Thank you for listening. We'll talk to you soon.